Hello, my friend. This one's very special. It is about Michel Henry's view on existential freedom. Now, Michel Henry was another French philosopher in the 20th century who taught at the University of Montpellier. And he was my tutor and became my supervisor for my philosophical dissertation. And so I learned a tremendous amount from Michel Henry, and he was a very significant influence on my work. Michel Henry was a radical phenomenologist. He taught Husserl. He knew more about Husserl than anybody else I've ever known. And he was also quite interested in Merleau-Ponty, as you will see. So for him, existential freedom would never be something you have or something you do through conscious choice. Instead, existential freedom is something you undergo through the sheer force of being alive. He disagreed with Sartre that existence precedes essence. Sartre believed that we were condemned to be free, if you remember, in a void of nothingness. Henry argued that we are condemned to something much greater and much deeper than that. We are condemned to life itself. So Henry spoke about radical immanence and the end of choice. His starting point was that true reality is not something concrete, and it is invisible. It doesn't happen out there in the world of object. It happens within you, in your interiority. It happens within the pathos of your interiority. The pathos is the experience of suffering, the experience of deep feeling that each of us is familiar with in our own interior life. So when Sartre said, freedom is the power to say no to the world, to negate the world, Henry argued that before you can say no to certain things, before you can say no to anything, you first have to experience the feeling of saying yes to your own life. And as long as you haven't said yes to your own life, you haven't truly begun to live yet. And Henry spoke about an existential birth that happens to not all of us, but to many of us at some point after we have been through a crisis or a difficult situation, because then we are challenged to come out of our shell and to come truly alive and to truly experience our own life inside of ourselves. And out of that, we may learn to say yes to our own life. The burden of self is that you did not choose to be born, and that you also cannot choose to stop feeling who you are. You will always have this feeling of being you. But you can do a lot with that. The most basic form of freedom, says Henry, is to be in a radical passivity, which is not unlike Deleuze's idea of spreading out in the rhizome. There is a kind of sense of just being and being connected and feeling the being and, enduring the joy and the suffering that is yours and which there is no distance from inside of you and which you cannot escape. You can make sense of it, but you can never escape it. And to come to terms with that awareness of your inner struggle, of your inner life, that is where freedom lies. So it's never a choice between options. Should I buy this or that? Should I do this or that? It is the power to act in your life from the center of yourself. To know that when you move your hand, you don't look at it as an object and then decide to move it. You experience the movement from the inside as a force. You don't use willpower to use it. It's not a decision to do it. You are at one with the body in the way in which you are in the world. And to own that, then you become part of that force of freedom that is a gift from life. Henry spoke about life having been given to each of us without us having asked for that gift. And he starts to make a connection between life and the divine in that way. So our freedom is actually our participation in the immense, surging power of life acting through us. You will find that in my work as well. And I'll soon do something on my own views of existential freedom, which of course you can find in my new book. But you see, in my new book, I haven't explained everybody else's view of freedom. I have just summarized the view of existential freedom that I have come to, which is why I wanted to do Michel Henry just before I spoke about my own work, because he probably was one of the major influences on my work, as was phenomenology in general. So instead of freedom as choice, we have freedom as power for Henry. Instead of the alienation that comes with the idea of the self that has to become free, the alienation is inevitable when you do that, because you will always feel small and lost in a massive universe. But with Henry's definition of freedom as part of life, in your internal radical experience of yourself, in that freedom you feel saturated with an immediate feeling of the fullness of being. Instead of pursuing your ego and a social mask and an attempt at being free as an ego, you go back to living in your interiority, where you experience the existence of your flesh, a very Merleau-Ponty term, the living reality of your life that is free by its own nature. Henry spoke about what is unfree in the world, and he called that barbarism, the barbaric idea of how we treat ourselves merely as objects or machines or biological or mechanical data. He, like Heidegger, was very much against modern technologies and certain types of scientism. True freedom is found by returning to the flesh. Stop looking at yourself from the outside as a body object. Start listening to the internal affectivity in your interiority, your emotions, your sensations, your pathos, your story. Act not because society tells you to, but because the internal force of life demands to be expressed. Henry is arguably the most intense of views on freedom, and he suggests that you are most free when you stop trying to decide who you are and instead simply embody the life that is already pulsing through you, and that is a gift.